Hi, let's talk about what I call the Taba Sanctuary Temple Synagogue. Taba Sanctuary Temple Synagogue is a big word, right? All right, it's actually my coinage. It's just a way to form a word that explains the relationship between the words tabernacle, temple, sanctuary, and synagogue. In the simplest of terms, that could mean the church as we have it today. But originally, it wasn't like that. All right, so let's go into it. How did we get these four words that the Bible most of the time make reference to? Now, the whole essence of the meeting place with God, that is what we call the church today, started with Moses. Moses actually erected a place called a tent that he placed outside the congregation of the Israel, that is outside the camp of the Israel while they were in the wilderness. The essence was to have a place where you can meet with God, where you can commune, meditate, had interaction, had fellowship alone without distraction from the people of Israel. So the Bible told us that he erected a tent and placed it outside the camp of the Israelites where he met with the Lord. Now, after the Israelites committed idolatry, God decided to dwell in the presence and the midst of his people. And so God gave Moses a template for a building, a structure that he can identify with and call the place of God. Now, that template, that building was what we're told that God told Moses to tell the Israel to bring a gift, an offering according to the willingness of their hearts. And that resulted and culminated into what we call the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle is a makeshift structure made of clothes and woods and all kinds of ornaments used to decorate it. It was a structure they used throughout their journey in the wilderness. It was actually the structure is actually the template for other buildings, other meeting place of God that came up later. All right, this was the placing place between the Israelite and God for several years until the time of David. David sort of ended that practice because the tabernacle, being a tent, being a makeshift structure, was easily collapsed and deconstructed and carried along wherever their journey took them in the wilderness. Now, when David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it his capital city, David decided to move the tabernacle to Jerusalem. You all know that David wanted to build a structure for God. Now, God said, no, your son will do it. That is Solomon. And David made preparation for Solomon. Now, when Solomon finally built the structure, that structure was called the temple. Now, the temple became the heart, the central place of the worship of the Jews. Just like the tabernacle was in the wilderness, where all the sacrifices, all the ablutions, all the things were carried out in the wilderness, the temple replaced that while in Jerusalem. Now, the temple became the centerpiece of the Jewish nation, the heart of the Jewish religion, culture, tradition, and everything. So quickly to differentiate, the temple is a structure built of stones, wood, etc., while the tabernacle that they had in the wilderness was actually a tent made up of tent and stone that were carried around, as the case may be. There came a time that the Israelites were defeated and they were carried into exile, and they were carried all over the world. Now, when that happened, there were some of these Jews that the place they carried them were just too far to come to Jerusalem. All right. Now, when you hear about Shiloh, these were just the time that the Israelites or the Jews from every part come together at the place where the tabernacle was, and at the place where the temple was, that was in Jerusalem. Okay, but it got to a time when they were exiled, when they were defeated, the temple was destroyed, and all the like. They couldn't come back to any place because the temple has been destroyed, especially by the Babylonians. They had to create a meeting place where they gathered and met. That was where the word synagogue came to be. Now, each place where the Jews found themselves, they erected what we call the synagogue. Eventually, the temple was reconstructed and rebuilt by Herod the Great. It was a beautiful temple, but as of that time, the culture of the synagogue had spread. It was a place of worship. It was a place to remind themselves of the heritage of the temple. So it was patterned after the temple. So out of the time of the apostles, that is in the New Testament, when the temple had been rebuilt, the synagogue had come to stay, has been established. So you find that while we had the temple in Jerusalem, we also had several synagogues in Jerusalem, okay, and other parts of the world. As a matter of fact, this synagogue was the forerunner of what we call the church today, because different sects arose, different teaching arose, different teacher arose. So you go to a time that we have synagogue of different sects, even though we had the temple, and they had their mode of worship similar to that of the temple. As of the time of the apostle, in the days of Jesus Christ, the temple had become more or less a symbol, a symbolic representation of of Yahweh, the God of the Jews. You understand? It has more or less become the signature of their religious belief. Now, the synagogue was what formed the pattern of what we have in church today. It was from this when the apostles were going from cities to city, they entered the synagogues. Now, the synagogues of the apostles were the synagogues where those who were not Jews had already started mingling with them, had already turned the place also to their own place of worship, coupled with other Jews. Now, it was mainly Judaism that was being practiced in most of these synagogues. So when the church began, that is when Christianity began, and they were being persecuted and driven out of the synagogue as heretics. What happened is that the Christians started meeting on their homes, on their own, in their own homes. They left the synagogues. Of course, the temple were not accessible again, and eventually the temple was destroyed again. Now, the church, the Christians started meeting on their own in homes, what we call house fellowship now. They started meeting on their own, and they read the letters of the apostles. I mean, those who are far after most of the time. As of that time, the time I'm referring to after the death of the apostles, they read the letters. Even when the apostles were still alive, they read their letters, encourage one another. And because they were of different tongues, there was need for interpretation. Sometimes when they read the Bible, when they read the scriptures, somebody needs to interpret it from the old Hebrew Aramaic, because as of the time of the Old Testament, of the New Testament, the time of the apostles, all the letters of the apostles we read now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all those gospels were not in existence. So what they had in existence available to them were the Torah, were the scriptures, what we call majorly the Old Testament today, and they were written in Hebrew Aramaic. So there was need for somebody, as the scriptures were read in the Hebrew Aramaic, in the original tongue, there was a need for somebody to interpret. That was the nature of the Christian church that later gradually metamorphosized into what we call the church today. Now, the sanctuary. The sanctuary is actually the hall in either the synagogue, the temple, or the tabernacle. You know, the tabernacle is basically divided into three: the holy, the most holy, the holy, and then the outer court. So that hall, or that auditorium, like we call it today, is what the Bible calls the sanctuary. So somebody can approach the temple or the tabernacle or the synagogue, and it's not within its sanctuary. The sanctuary is just all within. All right. So next time you're reading the Bible and you read the synagogue, you read about the tabernacle, you're seeing something like the synagogue, the tabernacle, the temple, you should understand what the Bible is talking about. It's simply the change of the place of worship from generation to generation. All right. See you another time. Have a blessed day.